All right, we're just going to let people trickle in to the Zoom room for a little bit.
Find their virtual seats, silence their phones.
Yes. And all right, I'm gonna go ahead and introduce everyone. Hello, my name is Morgan and I'm an event manager at Politics and Prose, and I'd like to welcome everyone to PNP Live. Soon, I will drop a link in the chat for where you can pre-order your paperback copy of The Cold Million straight from our website. The release date is Tuesday, October 5th. You can ask our speakers a question this evening by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can towards the end of the event, but we apologize in advance if we don't have time to address your question. Also, there are auto captions for this event by hitting the live caption button at the bottom of your screen. Let's introduce our guest. Jess Walter is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Beautiful Ruins, the national bestseller, The Financial Lives of Poets, the National Book Award finalist, The Zero, the Edgar Award-winning Citizen Vince, Land of the Blind, and the New York Times notable book, Over Tumbled Graves. Walter will be in conversation with Wiley Cash, the New York Times bestselling author of A Land More Kind Than Home, the acclaimed This Dark Road to Mercy, and most recently, The Last Ballad. He won the SIBA Book Award and the Conroy Legacy Award and was a finalist for the Penn/Robert W. Bingham Prize and the Edgar Allan Poe Award for Best Novel, and has been nominated for many more. A native of North Carolina, he is the Alumni Author-in-Residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. His new book, When Ghosts Come Home, published September 21st of this year. And he, along with Kimmy Cunningham Grant, have an event with Politics and Prose later this month on October 27th. So please give our guests a virtual round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Morgan. It's great to be here. I wish that, obviously, as we've all been saying for almost 2 years, I wish that we were all in person together there in DC, or at least maybe if Jess and I were somewhere in person doing this, that would be great. But this is the next best thing. So thank you all for joining us wherever you are, whether you're on the West Coast or here on the East Coast where I am. It's a pleasure to be here and to be with you, Jess. So thanks for letting me be part of this with you.
Thank you, Wiley, and congratulations on your new book, which is brilliant, by the way. I'm sorry this is a one-sided event. They wanted to talk about yours, and I said absolutely not. No,
that's who I know you to be as a literary citizen.
Yeah.
Jess. But this is a brilliant book as well. I loved reading this book,
Thank you.
and I really want to talk about some historical stuff today, some research stuff today, some craft stuff today. And let's get started. So, The Cold Millions. Can you give us kind of your elevator pitch on the book?
The novel is probably as close to a historical novel as I've ever written. It's set in my hometown, Spokane, Washington, in 1909, and it surrounds very real free speech protests that erupted when the industrial workers of the world, an early labor union, began protesting the fact that they weren't allowed to speak and gather in the streets. And it follows two brothers, Rye and Gig Dolan, who are itinerant workers, hobos as they would call themselves, in 1909, as they get swept up in this early labor action and kind of the wild group of characters that come around it, including Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a real life labor organizer who was sort of the actual hero of the free speech protests of Spokane in 1909.
So I have only been to Spokane one time. I was there for the library Common Book, maybe in 2017.
Yeah.
And the only time I've ever been to Spokane, I hung out with you, and I knew that you were from Spokane. I knew that you loved Spokane, but being there with you, I could really feel a palpable love, a kind of a tie you have to the place, to its history, to the people. And can you talk a little bit about writing about a place that you love, a place that you live, a place that you've got long ties to?
It's thank you, and yeah, it's such an interesting. It's been such an interesting journey because when I started writing, I thought Spokane was the last place I could write about. I thought it had no literary merit in a way. And one of the very first novels I ever started was set in Italy because of that, Beautiful Ruins. I started writing before I had published almost any of my other books, because I got to Italy and I thought, this is the kind of place you write a novel about.
Yeah.
And I think it was reading Southern writers and seeing like the way your writing is imbued with the character of the place, almost made me take another look at the place I was from and to find out what stories are elemental in that place. And that led to, a novel like Citizen Vince, which is about a criminal in the witness protection program, led to me making the observation that in one of my books that Spokane has more adult men per capita riding BMX bikes than any other city in the world. So sort of comic, observations about a hard scrabble working class place. But to go back to this moment for me was really special because it also tells this moment when the working class met the progressive movement, and when Spokane was really one of the points on this track of unionization and creating a middle class in America. It just felt like a really important story to try to tell.
Can you talk a little bit about, in the novel, you really showcase the divide between the haves and the have-nots. And our main character, who I would argue is kind of the heart of the novel, maybe not the intellect of the novel, bless his heart, as we would say in the South, but certainly the heart of the novel, Rye Dolan. You put him in several situations where we're really presented with the separation between the haves and the have-nots. Can you talk about maybe doing some research into class differences in Spokane in the early part of the 20th century?
I mean, one of the things that drew me to this story was the fact that the class differences are about as wide as you can get. At the time, it really helps to think of Spokane in that moment as a railroad town, which is what it was. And the railroad at the time is connecting the world the way the internet has in our lifetime. It was, and so Spokane was at the heart of a kind of Silicon Valley almost. 7 different rail lines passed through. Because of that, it was a sort of drain for all the wealth in the region. Those copper barons from Montana, the timber barons from Idaho, incredible agricultural wealth. And then because those 7 train lines came together in this one place, you could be going through Utah or north from Canada, and when you came through the Rocky Mountains, Spokane was the place the trains kind of pinched together. It meant that this was a gathering place for all of these itinerant workers, hundreds, sometimes thousands of hobos, bums, and tramps, as they called themselves, based on what it was they were doing, traveling by rail or walking, looking for agricultural jobs, for timber jobs, for mining jobs. And so you had all that concentrated wealth, which in the novel is characterized by this character named Lemuel Brand, who owns not just the mines and the timber camps, but owns he likes to say that every dollar he pays out in wages, he gets back in booze, bed, and brothel. And so he also owns the entertainment in town. And then at the other end are Gig and Rye, who, much like my 2 grandfathers, who in the 1930s were hobos who rode the rails, Gig and Rye they live that culture. And it was important to me to capture what my grandfather described as the sense of adventure of that. The Wobblies, the IWW, which Gig and Rye belong to, are like that. They sing and joke. They're wildly entertaining. And I wanted to try to capture some of that, as well. But I think that those 2 extremes one of the things that drew me to the story is we are living with the same income inequality that they were living with then. We have reached a point in America where we are at the same point that we were at during the end of the Gilded Age, exactly 1909. And so to create a character like Lem Brand, and then to create these workers, and I named them Rye and Gig intentionally with the idea of with the gig economy, that we are again at a place where we are really subject to the whims of billionaires, and so that's kind of the world Gig and Rye live in, where the Lem Brands of the world really own their bodies as well as their work.
Yeah, as you just said, I mean, there's that circularity to capitalism. You mentioned about Lemuel Brand, where he does make the joke, I pay them when they work, in the mine, or when they work in the factory or in the lumber camp or wherever. And then they go to the brothel I own, they drink the booze that I own, and all that money comes back to me. And so that money stays fixed, right, at the top.
Right.
And I was thinking about what you said just now about the current day resonance of the novel. And this novel feels incredibly current to me. A couple of things. There's a gorgeous scene where, and we can talk about teaching writing in a little bit. I know that you do that from time to time. I think for many of us, for some of us, poverty, deprivation are kind of abstractions, because we can't really imagine the kind of struggle that these young people, or these hobos, as you mentioned, Gig and Rye, and then early Rustin and Jewel, and are experiencing this kind of poverty. But you have this gorgeous part of the novel where Rye decides that he just really wants a pair of gloves, right? He just really wants a nice pair of gloves, and he comes across some money. We'll read the book to figure out how he comes across that money. And he goes into the nice part of town, and he leaves with this pair of gloves, and he gets a pair of gloves for his brother. And these gloves feel like they have come from the moon to him. This is the nicest thing he's ever touched, much less worn. And I was thinking about that and how far away that world feels to him, the world of the haves, but how in today's economy, these items like iPhones or designer tennis shoes are priced just at a price point where they're accessible.
Yeah.
But the life that they represent, the lifestyle, is not, right? Yeah. And I was thinking about how important those gloves are. Were you aware of the significance that you were instilling in those gloves as an object and as an abstraction?
Yeah, definitely. It is difficult in a novel to create that visceral need. And that the last time I was really poor was as a teenage father and college student, and to not have that safety net, and so to not have, because money is an abstraction, the billionaires who doubled their wealth during the pandemic, we can't even get our minds around the fact that they have $1.4 trillion. What does that mean? The economy of Europe, that 10 billionaires have that money. It because it's an abstraction, it does the opposite of what great fiction does, which is be visceral, be that you can feel it, you can breathe it and taste it. And so, yeah, it was finding those visceral things that can represent wealth. I remember as a young reader always being told that The Great Gatsby was the great novel about class. And I'm a first generation college student, first male in my family to graduate high school. And so when I read that book, I thought, this isn't about class, this is about rich people. It's like, this guy apparently got his money a different way. But to me, class can also be about two meth addicts trying to pawn a television, and you have to have aspiration no matter where you are. And for Rye, his mode of aspiration starts with clothing. He also wants to buy a suit later in the novel. Yeah. He is the poorest clothes horse you'll ever meet. For his brother Gig, early on, that place of aspiration is books, and specifically War and Peace, which he's only read 2/5 of, but pronounces it the greatest work of writing in the world. And that becomes Rye's other place too, as a library. And I know for you as a writer, it's the one place of democracy that still makes me weep is seeing a library, you know, the fact that Rye gets treated decently there. So yeah, the gloves were an important way to show that aspiration, and to have aspiration from the level that I recognize, not just a rich guy wishing he were richer or that he were accepted by the other rich people, you know, but the desire to live somewhere and have a home, you know, all those things we take for granted.
Sure, yeah. And you know, you mentioning Rye and Gig and these ideas and how these two brothers are kind of are characterized in the novel. Rye is certainly kind of the emotional center of the novel, and Gig really wants to be the intellectual heft of their relationship. He's a little bit older. What is he, 4 or 5 years older?
He's 23 and Rye's just turning 17, so almost
Okay.
6 years older. Yeah.
Yeah. So and Gig is really into workers' rights. He wants to organize. He's the one who wants to attend this free speech protest that gets them both locked into jail and is really the catalyst that animates so many relationships and so many tensions in the novel. And Rye kind of gets pulled along because he's the younger brother. He admires his younger brother, but in reality, he's always kind of cared for his younger brother, and that kind of arrives in his understanding a little bit later on. But there's this gorgeous line in the novel where somebody tells Rye, like, you've made a decision, you've done this, you've made a decision, and Rye finds himself wondering, like, have I ever had the luxury or the privilege of ever making any kind of choice, really?
Yeah, choosing
And
anything. Yeah.
yeah, and you do such a beautiful job of characterizing the power of this kind of poverty as the only choice they can make is really the choice of survival. It's not even a choice; it's a survival instinct. And that I have kind of a craft question that I was curious about and wondering how you did this. And I know you're interested in these genre distinctions, as am I, but literary novels are most often about characters' choices and the choices they make and how those, you know, propel the narrative or pace the narrative or affect relationships. But our primary character, Rye, is a character who doesn't really have choices to make, but still this novel is so propulsive. How did you do that? How did you have Rye be the center of a novel that really sweeps him up, but still make it be a novel that we're waiting to see what happens? How did you work that magic?
Boy, thank you. That's such a tricky and interesting question. In earlier versions of the novel, I wasn't sure who my protagonist was, honestly.
Mhm.
And I've done that before. I finished Beautiful Ruins at one point and looked up and said, did I forget to put a protagonist in my novel? I tend to like the side characters, the off characters. And I think there's a kind of causality that we want in fiction, which doesn't always exist in real life. Often we are buffeted along by winds that we don't see. We're on a ride that we don't remember paying for. And I like those kinds of stories where characters are swept along. Rye does eventually get to make decisions, but as I got to know my protagonist, my character, I realized he is not audacious and bold. And so to realize that the protagonist of your story is not the hero, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is the hero. And I grew up next to a drive-in movie theater, and watched all sorts of great old spaghetti westerns from my tree fort. And the image of a character like Clint Eastwood riding into town and confronting the corrupt powers that be in a certain town really animated what I thought of this novel. I thought, I'm writing the sort of Western my dad would love, except Clint Eastwood is played by a 19-year-old pregnant labor activist, you know. and so that I felt like Rye was almost the field upon which this is played.
Yeah. I love the idea of this being a Western, because when you think about it, all Westerns, you know, not all Westerns, but all the great Westerns begin with a stranger comes to town and something.
Right.
Happens.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely what happens. And nobody knows what to do with the stranger.
Yeah. And I was also taken, so, you know, I was working on this novel, and then the 2016 election happened, and I I told both of my daughters, you're going to wake up tomorrow morning and have the first woman president. And both of my daughters were out protesting that night. And I was so taken by youthful activism, and the characters in this novel are very young. Gig is 23, Rye's turning 17, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is 19. And I wanted to write about that, the energy of that youthful activism, and the leading edge of these kinds of people they're not always there to see the results of their work. Your character Ella Mae Wiggins in The Last Ballad, often people give their lives for these things, or they give their livelihood for it, and the real benefit comes to people like Rye, the quiet people who maybe agree but aren't leading the parade. They're watching it from the curb. It is, every time you write a novel, as you know what a novel should do, and then when you start breaking away from it, it's a combination of thrilling and terrifying. You're like, should my protagonist be so reactive? What's that going to do to the novel? And they're so elastic that they're called novel, which means new. So you should be trying to do new things in them, but what works, and what traditionally a novel does. And so I find a great energy in that, in playing with that and what I think it should do, and then seeing if I can stretch it some other way.
Yeah, and I think that your career kind of bears that out, especially with Beautiful Ruins. I mean, that's got a screenplay, a play, a autobiography. I mean, it's got so many parts, and this does as well. I mean, characters from third person end up being first person narrators, and it's just constantly, it's almost like a Rubik's Cube. It's changing in my hand as I'm reading it. And I felt that was such a way to immerse me as a reader into this world that you've created. It was just, it was so interesting and so fun to read. You mentioned the 2016 election and, not seeing the results coming. And I'm certainly in that boat. We had the night of the election, we went to bed late knowing how it was eventually going to turn out. But, our oldest had just turned 2 in September, and our youngest was about 6 months old. And there was a particular level of grief that we were feeling, especially my wife with these 2 young daughters, thinking that the future was going to be very different with them. And people like you and I, and maybe some of our viewers, saw the facade of success that was one of the decision makers in 2016, the facade of financial power and economic largesse that was proof positive of brilliance.
Yeah.
Lemuel Brand very clearly represents that in your novel.
Yeah.
And there are a couple of things, I'll let you talk about it if you want to talk about it, but there are a couple of things he does to try to impress people or try to trick people. And then he's like, aha, but I am Lemuel Brand. But there are some who see through it immediately, and they see that this guy is kind of a new money windbag. Yeah. And then there are others who are deeply impressed by what seems to be his intellectual capability, which must have been borne out in his financial success. So can you talk about those who see through him and those who do not see through him, and how that kind of drives some tensions in the novel?
Yeah, one of the tricks that he does is he poses as his own driver.
Yes.
He's gotten this big 7-person touring car, which he has flown the engineer out to build. And this was the kind of wealth that that Spokane, there were all of a sudden these mega rich millionaires who were in this city that was kind of their playground. So he poses his own driver and drives people back to his mansion in the big 7-person touring car. There's a kind of foolishness that I wanted at the center of him. Because I think I was stricken by that idea that something so banal and foolish couldn't be dangerous. And maybe the banal and foolish are even more dangerous. Yes. there's that great saying about one of our former presidents, that he's a hobo's idea of a millionaire. And I just had that in my mind the whole time. You know, this is the kind of person who would have gold toilets and would, you know, have a library that, you know, whose books he never touched. You do as well as any writer I know. Your novels are in conversation with the present. Even the title of When Ghosts Come Home, you know, is a nod to the idea that you experience an historical novel through the eyes of the present. And that, to me, I just kept finding echoes. I just kept thinking, oh, this is like now. You know, I was doing research and I was reading deeply into newspapers from that time. And I had somehow thought that our bifurcated news system was new. And then you go back to 1909, and I would read what the establishment newspapers would say about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and the 500 protesters who were arrested, many of them beaten, at least 3 killed by the Spokane police. And to them, it was, you know, the police are wiping out the riffraff, and these are foreigners. They don't even speak English. Many of them have dark skin, you know. And then I would read what the labor newspapers would say, and they were being, you know, hunted by Hibernian toughs. You know, they're taking shots at the Irish, and you know, and it was cubist. It was like seeing these things, and you really did choose your news based on which newspapers you subscribe to. And so to see that cyclical nature, that this thing that bothers me the most about the media, that we can't possibly, you know, we can't possibly fix the things that need to be fixed if we're not even getting the same information.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned my novel Last Ballad, which is about Ella Mae Wiggins. And that was based on a true event, a mill strike that happened in North Carolina in 1929. And after she was murdered, no spoiler alert, that's shared relatively early in the novel, but after she was murdered, she was the mother of 9 children, 4 of whom had died from whooping cough, pellagra, these poverty-related illnesses. She was murdered by people from the mill, you know, and they were all bailed out. None of them were ever found guilty. And then after her death, she was just slandered in newspapers around the country, really. This is a strike that made news in every major newspaper around the world, as did her murder. But in local newspapers, especially, I mean, she was slandered and called a loose woman, although her husband had abandoned her. She was called an N-word lover because she lived in a Black community and worked at an integrated mill because she was poor. That's why those things were true in her life. And her children grew up deeply ashamed of being Ella Mae's children, because that's the power of media. That's the power of the angle. That's the power of the story. When you were researching this, did you find people who either didn't know or who maybe didn't want you to look at this or didn't want you?
You know, that it, I think one of the great surprises for me has been the incredible response from people in the Northwest, from people all over the country, really. We are taught history as a kind of you know, continuous line, and but as it moves on, things slip between the cracks. Entire movements slip between the cracks. The mining wars of the Northwest, we were never taught. Very little tribal history. You know, it's sort of the Civil War and then the Spanish-American War, and then all of a sudden it's World War I. You know, you bounce from wars to wars. Maybe you dip into the Depression, and so you get a sense of this arc of history, but it misses these really important things. And maybe it's the job of the historical novelist to go rooting around the couch cushions looking for, you know, the Ella Mae Wiggins of the world, or the Spokane free speech protests of the world. But I think it's the relevance to the world we're living in now makes revisiting it more than just, you know, a moment of civic pride. Oh, look, Spokane was, you know, at one time, Spokane was the most thriving city in the West, had the largest theater stage in the world, as the boosters keep telling characters. More than that, what happened there changed the course of labor history, which in turn helped build a middle class, which in turn, you know, brought about this this prosperity and this, not for everyone, but and so to go back and find an organization like the Industrial Workers of the World, which were the first union to take any nationality, any race, women. They would go to brothels and try to get the sex workers to join the union. To find that, was, for me, it was a thrilling thing. And then to get emails from people from all over the country who say, my grandfather was in the IWW. He never wanted to talk about it, but here's this story. And I've gotten more emails on this book from people sharing their personal histories than anything I've ever written. And every one of them is kind of moving, people reconciling with their own family's past. And I think, it's hard because the union story that maybe developed, this book is not a complete defense of unions. Any human institution is going to be rife with corruption. But we sort of left off the story with Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters, and and there is another kind of elemental union story to tell. And I think you told it beautifully in The Last Ballad, and and hopefully this also does, that says, politics aside, lifting up the least of us is what we have to do to lift us all up, and that really simple, basic, elemental belief is why I really wanted to go to the early days and present a case that, should these itinerant workers have to pay $1 for a job that they're going to lose in 2 weeks to make just a few bucks, if they cut their foot off, they'll have no medical attention, and then the job shark will send out another employee. Is that, we can all agree to the sheer unfairness of that world, or of the 6-day work week or the 7-day work week. Those elemental moments show what, the power, I think, of what early labor was able to do.
Absolutely. With what early labor was able to do against great forces aligning against them. And there's a moment in the novel where Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and Rye have had some things kind of go sideways on a trip out to a town called Taft. And
which really existed, by the way. Taft, Montana was the sewer of America, so named because before he was elected president, Taft visited and said it was the most disgusting, vile place he'd ever seen. And so the madams and gamblers and other reprobates in the town voted unanimously to take that as their name. So tells you just how proud they were of what a hard work camp this was. It was like Deadwood without the charm.
That's like here in North Carolina, some conservative politicians called Asheville the cesspool of the South, and now that's like the unofficial tagline for Asheville, cesspool of the South.
Great. Yeah.
But there's a line where Rye is like so overwhelmed by the bad turn that their fortunes took in Taft, Rye and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. And speaking to the power of union, the power of community, these emails that you've gotten, I received a number of them as well when I wrote about labor in The Last Ballad, and the hope that these organizers and speakers and reporters like the Labor Defender and other publications, they had to keep this generative, self-sustaining hope going. And I want to mention that here. There's a scene where they're talking, Rye and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, and he says, "Don't you want to take a day to rest after this terrible turn their fortunes have taken?" And Flynn says, "I don't have a day, Ryan. We have to keep the pressure up. But you said yourself, we have no money and no bodies." The other side doesn't know that, she said.
Yeah.
So, and that's at a moment in the novel where things are going terribly for the organizers, for Flynn, for Rye, his brother's still in jail. But this is also the point in the novel, I guess we're entering toward the final act, where the novel takes on this incredible momentum as well. So can you talk about that point in the novel as things seem to be coming apart in terms of organized labor and this big action they're planning? That's where you decided the novel was going to take off on this really, that's kind of where Rye comes alive as a character also.
Yeah, after he makes the realization that he hasn't really had choice in his life, I felt it important to give him a choice, and so but I also was really taken by the actual Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who showed up in Spokane after 500 were arrested because she was a woman and pregnant. And remember, this is 10 years before women even have the right to vote. She's not allowed to go out and speak. Even the other union members, the other union leaders don't want her speaking on street corners. They feel like it's unseemly for a pregnant woman to be doing that. And so I was just so taken by her audacity and courage. And she continued to speak and continued to prod the authorities until she was arrested, and then used her own arrest to show that they'd gone too far. And in that way, and then once she was imprisoned, she actually performed this act of journalism. She uncovered this wild, and she really did. She uncovered this this abuse of female prisoners that was going on in the jail that forced the police chief to resign. And it was such an act of courage, and I knew the novel needed to get to that point. And again, that I was thinking about the activists, who protest the lack of reasonable gun laws, the Parkland shooting survivors. I was thinking about kids who walk out of school for climate change protest. I was thinking about the energy it takes to do that when the adults around you say there's nothing we can do. It's real politic. There's nothing that can be done. And that energy is that audacity. I wanted the novel. I also knew that the last thing I wanted to do was write a proletariat novel in which people just go around and give speeches.
Yeah.
And I read a few of those, and and even the Wobblies, they were going around singing. It was pretty thrilling, and they were funny, the things they were doing, but I still wanted a novel filled with action. I wanted to write that Western, every step of the way, and to have big archetypal characters. And part of it is because if you look at the mining wars that began in the late 1800s and ended right around this period, they were full of double agents and Pinkerton detectives infiltrating. And there's a great book called Big Trouble by J. Anthony Lucas, which really details some of that. And you have these characters whose sheer ambiguity, 100 years later, we still don't know if they were anarchists or Pinkertons or what they were. Kind of motivated me to embrace a sort of ambiguity in the action of the novel too. I'm going to have big action in this novel. I want it to be one of those. Would want my dad, the lifelong labor and Western guy, to love this. I would want my grandfather, who had this, pirate adventuring heart, to enjoy it. I wanted that action to rise to the level of the history, I guess.
Yeah, there are several scenes in the novel that are big action, a couple of even like big set piece action moments that are really, there's a lot of suspense. There's a lot of tightly wound, suspenseful scenes in the novel. And I think it's interesting what you said. You didn't want to write a proletariat novel. And when I wrote Last Ballad, I didn't either. And I actually did an event with a labor historian named Bryant Simon. And that was the first thing he said to me at this event. He said, "Man, you did not write a proletariat novel." And I said, I didn't, because those aren't interesting to me, because those are like big idea novels where the characters are turned into vessels for ideas.
Yeah, even if you agree with the policy or the idea, a novel is not the place. A novel is about character and momentum and and narrative. And I totally agree. Being a former journalist, I spent a few years thinking that maybe I could break news in my novels, which when they come out a year after after the events you're describing, it's really hard to break news in a novel. And I also think that if you can change people's minds and you can get across great ideas, but you have to do it through character and narrative.
Yeah.
And those things, if you start cheating, the reader knows, human nature has to still be the guiding force of a novel, or or it just doesn't feel right, you know.
And I think what's so beautiful about this novel, Jess, and I can say the same thing for Beautiful Ruins, is that you do such a wonderful job of creating and sustaining characters who are in conflicts with themselves. Not only, you know, the Proletariat novel is character in conflict with the environment, character in conflict with the structure.
Sure.
You've got that, but you've also got characters in conflict with themselves. And that there's nothing, to my mind, more human than that. And these are just incredibly resonant human characters. I want to remind folks who are watching, if you have a question, go down to the Q&A button on your screen and you can ask Jess the question about The Cold Millions, or about Beautiful Ruins, or about any of his other novels or his nonfiction books. I've got a few more that I want to ask, but we'd love to hear from you. Writers, I can promise you the best part is the questions that we get from readers, because that's what keeps it fresh for us. That's what allows us to see our work in a way that we might not have considered seeing it before. So, Jess, I want to ask you, War and Peace, I think that Gig has read the first 2 volumes of a 5-volume set, and it's kind of—
I think he's read 1 and 3. I think
1 and 3, that's it. 1 and 3 of the 5-volume set. And it's kind of a motif of sorts in the novel. Can you talk about Russian literature? And I wondered if you were thinking about ideas of, obviously, the wars, but also Russian peasantry, landed gentry, things like that when you were writing Cold Millions.
Yeah, definitely. The first idea was that Gig would be the sort of autodidact that I often am. You know, being somewhat self-taught, I was the kind of person who would pronounce, you know, 40% of something I'd read as the greatest work ever, because I would be so impressed by someone else saying it. Or, you know, if you've read so little, when you start reading, it really knocks you out that way. And so I wanted to give Gig that again, something that I recognized in myself, a kind of intellectual insecurity that would lead him to do that. But that book itself does resonate for me, and all of Tolstoy resonates for me for the very reasons you said, for his understanding of class and humanity, and specifically that book, in which you meet a group of characters and then the wave of history washes over them. In this case, the Napoleonic Wars and the invasion of Russia. In my character's case, the wave of history that washes over them is a very different one, but with many of the same issues. And so I had never read War and Peace, and I saw a play in New York probably 15 years ago, Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet, which just takes as its centerpiece a few moments from the book, and it was staged off Broadway in a theater that was made to look like an old Russian saloon. And you came in, and all the actors were waiters, and they would slam a bottle of vodka and some pierogies down on your table, and then the play would just go on around you. The waitresses and waiters would be part of it, and it was like breathing the novel. And I went back to that novel with a kind of frenzy, and it's interesting because I feel like right now our attention is so fractured by our cell phones and by computers, and a novel like that, you can't do anything but live in it.
Yeah.
And so imagining Rye reading that over the next few years, imagining him, and Rye is drawn back to the novel as a way to try to understand his brother in a way, and imagining him experiencing that immersion, and really, you know, if the novel is a coming of age story for Rye, he really comes of age when he expands beyond his own boundaries and is able to see himself in one of the, you know, the great works of Russian literature. And I love moments like that when characters are made larger by literature. You know, there are 2 scenes in a library in this book, and I burst into tears writing both of them, just because they seem, you know, that it just seems so, it's so moving to me, and it's one of another great heartache of mine is another place that should be equal but is not, is education. We should have the same opportunities for for everyone, because that is the only sort of social escalator that exists, is education. And rise education to me is kind of holy in a way, and what better guide than Count Tolstoy.
Well, there's speaking of the scenes in the library, I think it's a Carnegie Library as well.
Yeah.
There's this beautiful moment where Rye goes into the library. It's his first time in a library. And it's also the first time, at least to the reader's mind, it's the first time we see someone who is gentle with Rye, that doesn't want anything from him in return.
Yeah, and shows him this world that that and that again, I'm a big subscriber to Charles Baxter's idea of rhyming action, that it's not so much the repetition of action, but that they can rhyme the way poetry can. And to me, that moment is such an echo of the first moment when he's in Lem Brand's library, where the title comes from, and he has that moment of realization that most of the people he knows will never see a library like this, and especially his brother, who he knows loves books. That moment, he thinks about the cold millions who will never have a chance in the world. And so I felt like that second section in the Carnegie Library really was sort of the call and response of that movement.
And then keeping with the theme of bringing 1909 to 2016, that Lemuel Brand library, which is so important, another character comes along and visits that same library and reckons correctly that none of these books have ever been opened.
Yeah, there's
nothing worse than wealthy people using books to show off their stuff.
The show library,
The show library. You mentioned earlier there's nothing to do with a book like that except live in it, except immerse yourself in it. Speaking of War and Peace. And I'm not just saying this because you're here and because we're friends and because I think a lot of you in your work. That's how I feel about your work, especially Beautiful Ruins and The Cold Millions. The Cold Millions is a little bit of a newer novel, but I have met so many people, Mallory, my wife included, who really lived in Beautiful Ruins. I mean, both of these books are so immersive and so whole in your ability to create the world and give us enough space to live in it with these characters. And I'm wondering about, when do you know? I mean, these are two big books. I mean, I'm not saying that it's big because it's long. It's only, the paperback's 340 something pages. This isn't like a doorstop book, but it's a big book. And Beautiful Ruins is a big book. Financial Lives of Poets is more of a narrow book, right? It's just narrow. It might be the same length, maybe a little bit shorter, but it's a more narrow book. When do you know in the process that you're writing a big book or a more narrow, maybe a single character book?
That's such an interesting question. I think pretty early on, with this book, you talked about the first person versus third person sections. And I was writing that third person section. I started writing these first person sections, the first one of which chronologically takes place in 1864. And then the last one takes place in 1964. Often for me, it's the audacity of ambition. I start thinking of 100 Years of Solitude and thinking, I'm going to write 100 years of my hometown. And that becomes such a big issue. The river, the Spokane River, is the central motif and also drives the plot in many ways. And I started envisioning the novel as the river, as this third person stream that I would bring these first person undercurrents into. And that kind of thinking, that kind of structuralist thinking, is really helpful to me in devising the novel. But it also ends up connecting thematically. And I think it naturally makes a book bigger. If you're going to try to span 100 years, if you're going to move around in time and character, I kept seeing these pictures. I have a vision of the late 19th, early 20th century as these teeming streets. And I wanted a novel that felt like it was teeming in that way. I had these old postcards that just showed, downtown Spokane with 20,000 people catching streetcars and riding horses. And, and I wanted that wanted that sense. And so I think early on for me, it's almost like the novel gets away from me, and then you're just thinking like, well, I guess I have to put the Donner Party in my Italian novel. I have no choice, and it's, I think it comes from books that I love, and I want to say the same thing about your work. I think you imbue your characters with such humanity, and the new one, When Ghosts Come Home, it's just breathless, and yeah, I love your work, and I think the way you write your region especially, I just am so impressed by. So
Well,
anyway,
thank you. I
yeah,
appreciate that. And I'm so glad you mentioned putting the Donner Party in Beautiful Ruins, because I always thought it was so hilarious. I imagine you be thinking, well, now the Donner's Party is in it, I might as well write a screenplay just called Donner! Exclamation.
I mean,
And,
I remember my editor saying, maybe you could cut the Donner Party, and I turned it in with it twice as long, and it's like this, like some incorrigible child, but yeah, I think I'm just constantly inspired by what other writers do, and then challenging myself to see what else the novel can bear, what else you can do with it. I do feel like the next novel I write will be thinner, only because the topic I'm writing feels more self-contained, I guess.
Sure. Yeah, I can say when I wrote The Last Ballad, I thought about Beautiful Ruins, and I've never thought about the idea of the novel being novel. Make it new, make it, this curiosity, this thing nobody's seen before. But I remember reading Beautiful Ruins and thinking, this book does everything to my mind that a book can do, and it pushes so many boundaries. And with Last Ballad, I thought, I'm going to do that. I'm going to see how much I can put into this book without breaking it, right? How many characters I can put in.
I love you brought in other voices, and you broke time, and it's almost like the superpower of a novel, and you do that in your new one too, moving forward in time that way. I think it is something that fiction can do, that creates this resonance that very few forms can.
Yeah. And after reading Beautiful Ruins, I decided I was going to try to do so many of the genre bending, boundary defying things.
Yeah.
And then I tried a lot of them. And then it's interesting. You kind of, I don't want to say retreat back to your talents, but you kind of you put your toe in the water and you say, I could try that, but I can't sustain it. And it's so interesting how we kind of find our ways. And When Ghosts Come Home is a much more narrow book than Last Ballad was, because I exhausted so much of myself writing and researching that book.
Yeah, it can be exhausting. It can, but I've never finished a book and not thought, this taught me something about writing.
Sure.
And even if it's your limitations or how hard something is. And I think it always cracks me up, because I've had literary friends who are like, when I need money, I'm just going to write a great pot boiler. And similarly, people, crime writers who write a book a year say, well, if I had 6 years, I could write, I could win a Pulitzer Prize too. And if it's not in here, if it's a kind of writing you don't love, it's amazing how hard it is.
It is, absolutely. I totally agree. We have a question from Rita, and Rita asks, she says your full name, so I'm gonna say your full name. Jess Walter. Sounds like you're in trouble.
I thought my middle name was coming out there.
I've read a number of your novels, and I'm struck by how chameleon-like you are as a writer. Could you talk about how you choose your topics and approach?
Thank you so much. I don't have that sense when I'm writing. I get kind of carried away by things, and language especially. So for instance, with this novel, the language of 1909, the Bindlestiffs and the Morbs and Lobcocked and all these things just kind of get me all carried away. And I start, I venture down these roads, and I'm really just sort of writing the next story I want to write. I think I did end up taking some perverse pleasure in being really unpredictable at some point. And I would like to think I've outgrown that as I've matured, that I would just, write for, the sense of a great story, but I do love to challenge myself. There was a moment in The Cold Millions when I realized that a character I was writing about was going to die, and we were going to see that on the page. And I was like, I've never done that before. And the thrill I got doing something I'd never done before, and seeing if I could pull it off, and then seeing, wow, what resonance does this give to that character's life and to the rest of the story? And what does it say about the creator of the story that he'll just randomly kill people you're following, you know? So the discoveries that happen when, I guess, I change form or try something I haven't done, that I love that. And I sometimes think I'm a more natural short story writer, even though I haven't had as much success at that. And I have another book of short stories coming, but the playfulness of that really appeals to me. So I think it's a sense of play. One of the things I love about musicians, no musician says I'm going to work. They say I'm going to play. All novelists do is work. You know, and yet there is a sense of play on the page. It's kind of thrilling what we get to do, that we get to invest our time in that. And when you're lost in a novel, it can feel like play. It can feel like this world you don't want to leave. And so I know you have musician friends too, and I love that idea of work as play. I love thinking that that's what I'm doing. It also makes it easier to open a file if you're just imagine you're playing.
Well, I remember the first time I met you, it was on that pre-pub tour with Ben Fountain, and we went out. They sent us to 3 or 4 cities.
Which I think publishing should do. I thought we were the greatest band, Wiley, Ben Fountain, and me. We just got to go out and talk about our books together, and yeah, it was. But anyway, I'm interrupting, but it was so.
No, fun. that was such a foundational experience for me to not. I had a book on the way, but not a book out, and I remember trying to soak up everything I could from you and Ben. Not Ben so much with all the. But
well, he was soaking it up himself, because
yes, that's right. Ben hadn't. We're teasing, of course. Ben will never see this. Ben probably doesn't even know what Zoom is. But I remember asking you, and I knew both your work and Ben's work. And I remember asking you. You've done so many things. You've written nonfiction. You've written a nonfiction book. You've written short stories. You've published these great novels. How do you do it? And you said, because you can always work on something. That has stayed with me since you said that.
Yeah, I do think if I have any superpower, I was writing for so long with nobody paying attention, that I wrote short stories for 7 years before I ever published one. I sold my first 3 books without an agent because I was just writing in this corner of the Northwest, and that freedom of just writing what you want, experimenting, trying to get better. I think it's been the key to not getting writer's block. Is I can always open another file, and I'll often have 2 or 3 things going at once. And thank you, and thank you so much for doing this. And
of course,
and really, congratulations on the novel. That's so suspenseful and terrific.
Thank you, Jess. It's awesome seeing you, man. I hope you have a great
rest of
your time on the road.
I wish Harper would send us out, get the band back together.
That's right. I know. Tell Ben to get a book out.
Fountain can drive. He can drive the band, since he doesn't have anything to talk about.
And on the behalf of Politics and Prose, I would like to thank you both, Jess Walter and Wiley Cash, for having this event with us. We also like to thank our audience for tuning in today. And before you go, we would like to remind you that you can pre-order your paperback copy of The Cold Millions from the link that is in the chat. Your book purchases are what make it possible for us to have these events, especially our free ones. And we also encourage you to RSVP for Wiley Cash's event with Kimmy Cunningham Grant at the end of the month. If you just hit that link also, that's in the chat. And I wish everyone a great evening.
Thank you, Morgan. Thanks, Wiley.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, Jess. See y'all later.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.